In 1968, a photograph captured an Australian soldier in the jungles of Vietnam, carrying what looked like a mutilated rifle. The barrel had been sawn off just inches from the receiver. The flash hider was gone. A jury-rigged pistol grip jutted awkwardly from the stock. To anyone familiar with military regulations, the weapon appeared butchered, as though someone had taken a hacksaw to government property in a moment of madness. The modification violated every rule in the manual. Possession of such a weapon could result in court-martial. Yet this illegal firearm would prove to be the most effective close-quarters weapon deployed by any force in the Vietnam War. Australian Special Air Service soldiers called it the bitch, and over 5 years of operations, men carrying these unauthorized modifications would achieve a kill ratio of 246-1, a record unmatched in modern warfare. When Navy SEAL Roger Hayden spent 10 days with these Australians, he would later admit he learned more about reconnaissance from them than from all his formal military training combined. The question this story raises remains relevant today. When does breaking the rules become the right decision? Tell me in the comments whether soldiers should be allowed to modify their weapons in combat zones, and watch until the end to discover how an illegal weapon influenced military doctrine worldwide. On June 16, 1966, 3 Squadron, Australian Special Air Service Regiment, arrived at Vung Tau via Saigon and moved to Nui Dat the following day to begin operations that would continue for 5 years. The squadron formed part of the 1st Australian Task Force, a brigade-sized formation that would eventually number 7,000 personnel at initial deployment, making it substantial by Australian standards, though modest, compared to American deployments elsewhere in Vietnam. The task force established its base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, located southeast of Saigon, in terrain that covered approximately 1,000 square miles of varied landscape, including rubber plantations, rice paddies, jungle-covered mountains, and scattered villages. Unlike American units operating under Military Assistance Command Vietnam Coordination, the Australians established an independent area of operations that gave commanders freedom to develop tactical approaches distinct from the massive search and destroy sweeps characterizing American operations elsewhere in South Vietnam. The 120 personnel of 3 Squadron organized into troops of around 30 men each, according to standard SAS structure. These troops deployed in patrols of 4 to 6 soldiers, most commonly 5-man teams that balanced operational effectiveness with the need for stealth in jungle operations. Between June 20th and 22nd, each troop conducted a 24-hour patrol of the area immediately around the base at Nui Dat to familiarize themselves with the terrain and operational environment. The first enemy contact occurred on June 25th, when 3 Squadron was fired on by a group of Viet Cong. The engagement marked the beginning of a deployment that would see Australian Special Operations Forces become among the most feared units operating in Vietnam. The enemy forces operating in Phuoc Tuy Province presented a formidable challenge. The Viet Cong 5th Division maintained its headquarters in the Mae Tao Mountains under Senior Colonel Nguyen the Truyen, a veteran communist commander who had fought the French in the First Indochina War. The division fielded 2 main force regiments with substantial combat capability. The 274th Regiment, considered the stronger and better trained of the 2, operated from the Hat Dich area in northwestern Phuoc Tuy with 3 battalions numbering around 2,000 men. The 275th Regiment conducted mobile operations across the province with nearly 1,400 personnel, organized into 3 battalions. The D4 4-5 Battalion, a local force unit of 250 to 350 fighters, possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and maintained close connections with village populations. These units had operated in the province for years, developing detailed knowledge of trails, villages, hiding places, and local supporters that gave them significant advantages over newly arrived Australian forces. The challenge presented itself starkly during the night of August 16th through 17th, 1966, when Viet Cong forces attempted to demonstrate their capability to strike the Australian base. Using mortars and recoilless rifles, they bombarded Nui Dat from positions about 2 kilometers east of the base until Australian counter-battery fire forced them to cease after inflicting some casualties. The following morning, D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment departed to locate the firing positions and determine the withdrawal direction. On August 18th, in a rubber plantation near Long Tan, the company encountered a force of regimental strength in prepared positions. Despite being outnumbered by ratios estimated as high as 20-1, D Company held its ground through hours of intense combat that tested the discipline and courage of Australian soldiers in circumstances that might have overwhelmed less professional forces. Artillery support from the New Zealand 161st Battery and the timely arrival of armored personnel carriers carrying reinforcements prevented the Australian position from being overrun during fighting that raged through a monsoon rainstorm, reducing visibility to meters and turning the red earth of the rubber plantation to slippery mud. When the engagement ended, at least 245 Viet Cong bodies lay on the battlefield, according to the official count, though the actual casualty figure may have been higher as the enemy withdrew many dead and wounded during the night. 18 Australians had been killed and 24 wounded. The Battle of Long Tan established Australian dominance over Phuoc Tuy province and became a defining moment in Australian military history. The Viet Cong 5th Division, though it remained capable of operations, never again mounted a direct challenge to the task force base at Nui Dat. Australian units began extending their operational radius, conducting patrols and establishing the security perimeter that would define their tactical area of responsibility for the next 5 years. Yet the tactical dominance achieved at Long Tan did not translate into the close-quarters jungle fighting that SAS patrols faced daily in areas beyond artillery support, where survival depended on weapons designed for a different kind of war. The mission parameters for Special Air Service operations differed fundamentally from the conventional infantry engagements that had characterized Long Tan. SAS patrols served as the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force, conducting long-range reconnaissance in areas beyond helicopter extraction range, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and dispositions. Primary mission requirements emphasized avoiding contact when possible to maintain the patrol's intelligence-gathering capability. Secondary requirements demanded decisive break contact capability if the patrol was discovered, because 5-man teams operating days or weeks without support could not survive prolonged engagement with numerically superior enemy forces. Heavy vegetation throughout Phuoc Tuy province limited visibility to meters in many areas. Movement through thick undergrowth required careful navigation around vines, branches, and bamboo that caught on equipment and clothing. Patrols sometimes covered only a few hundred meters in a full day when operating near suspected enemy positions, where rapid movement might compromise their presence. The standard L-1A1 self-loading rifle issued to Australian forces measured 44.5 inches in overall length with a 21-inch barrel. Loaded with a 20-round magazine, the weapon weighed nearly 11 pounds. The rifle was semi-automatic only by regulation, requiring a separate trigger pull for each shot fired. These specifications had proven adequate for conventional infantry operations in open terrain, but in the confined spaces of Vietnamese jungle, the long barrel caught on vegetation with every movement and the semi-automatic fire mode provided insufficient volume of fire for a 5-man patrol attempting to simulate a larger force when compromised by enemy contact. Squadron armorers working at unit level created the solution. Men who understood that combat necessity overrode peacetime regulations. These individuals, whose names went unrecorded in official histories because their work violated every regulation governing military weapons, took it upon themselves to modify the standard-issue rifles in ways that would better serve the soldiers whose lives depended on them. The process began in late 1966 and early 1967 as armorers experimented with different approaches to creating a weapon more suited to jungle warfare. A standard-issued L1A1 would be taken into the workshop where the barrel was cut at the front sight post, immediately in front of the gas block. This modification removed approximately 6 inches from the standard 21-inch barrel, dramatically reducing the overall length of the weapon. The gas tube and piston were shortened correspondingly, with the gas port moved back the same distance to maintain the rifle's gas-operated function. The flash hider was removed entirely on most weapons, though some armorers added a cone-shaped replacement to the exposed barrel. The result was a weapon that could move through heavy vegetation with far less resistance than the standard rifle, allowing soldiers to maintain stealth while navigating jungle terrain. Converting the weapon from semi-automatic to full automatic fire presented greater technical challenges. Early experiments involved using matchsticks to modify the sear mechanism in standard L1A1 rifles, though this approach proved unreliable. The better solution came from acquiring parts from the L2A1 heavy barrel variant of the rifle, which had been designed for automatic fire. Lower receiver parts from the L2A1 could be installed in the L1A1, creating a weapon modified for full automatic fire only, not selective fire. This deliberate choice forced soldiers to use the weapon properly for its intended purpose of delivering overwhelming firepower in break contact scenarios, rather than attempting aimed semi-automatic fire, for which the shortened barrel made it unsuitable. Additional modifications refined the weapon's effectiveness through 1967 and into 1968. The standard 20-round magazine was replaced with 30-round L2A1 magazines that increased ammunition capacity by 50%. Forward pistol grips were added to some weapons, fabricated from Owen gun grips or custom-made by welding metal rods to standard pistol grips that could fit over the shortened barrel. The XM148 40mm grenade launcher, obtained from United States forces, was mounted below the barrel on some versions, providing additional firepower for patrols operating without artillery support. Shortened stocks appeared on certain weapons to further reduce overall length. Camouflage paint schemes in greens and browns helped the weapons blend into jungle environment. Each modified rifle emerged slightly different from the workshop, depending on the armorer's approach and the specific parts available, creating variety in configurations that would later be documented in photographs taken during 1968. The nickname emerged from the weapon's characteristics in use. The bolt's twisting motion during full automatic fire, combined with the weapon's lightweight after-barrel removal, made it all but impossible to hold on target during sustained fire. The enormous ball of fire that erupted from the muzzle when a 30-round magazine was expended in seconds created a visual and psychological impact that far exceeded the weapon's accuracy. Soldiers began calling these modified rifles the bitch, in recognition of both the difficulty of controlling them and their devastating effectiveness when employed properly. The name spread through the squadrons as more weapons were modified, and soldiers shared their experiences using them in combat. The risk these armorers and the soldiers who used their creations accepted was substantial. The modifications violated military regulations worldwide. Possession of such a weapon could result in disciplinary action or court-martial under normal circumstances. The rifles could not be officially acknowledged or documented in any formal records. Every squadron that rotated through Vietnam continued the practice of modifying weapons because combat effectiveness demanded the violation of regulations written for peacetime conditions. The gap between official doctrine developed in garrison environments and the battlefield reality faced by five-man patrols operating beyond support in enemy-controlled territory became impossible to ignore. Soldiers made the calculation that survival and mission success outweighed regulatory compliance. They chose to carry weapons that worked in their environment over weapons that met administrative requirements. A system developed to preserve this knowledge across squadron rotations. The modified rifles stayed in Vietnam rather than returning to Australia, where they would have been immediately confiscated and destroyed as contraband. When one squadron completed its tour and prepared to depart, the weapons were turned over to the arriving squadron. Experienced soldiers would sit down new arrivals and explain the employment doctrine for these unauthorized weapons, passing tactical knowledge from one rotation to the next. Old hands described how to use the weapon's characteristics effectively, when to employ full automatic fire, how to manage the muzzle flash and recoil, what tactical situations called for the 30-round magazine's firepower. This informal education created continuity of expertise that official training channels could never have provided. By mid-1968, the modified rifles had become standard equipment for SAS patrols operating throughout Phuoc Tuy province, weapons that officially did not exist, but that every soldier trusted with his life. The modified weapons reflected a tactical philosophy that differed fundamentally from American operational doctrine as it evolved under General William Westmoreland's command. Westmoreland commanded Military Assistance Command Vietnam from 1964 to 1968, pursuing a strategy of attrition based on the assumption that American firepower could inflict unsustainable casualties on communist forces. American forces conducted large-scale search and destroy operations designed to locate enemy concentrations, fix them in place, and annihilate them through overwhelming firepower from artillery, tactical air support, and heavy bombers. Multi-battalion sweeps moved through suspected enemy areas, supported by massive artillery preparation and tactical airstrikes that devastated the landscape. Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers delivered carpet bombing against suspected base camps and assembly areas. Each aircraft carrying 30 tons of bombs that could devastate areas measuring thousands of square meters. The measure of success became the body count, with detailed tallies of enemy dead reported up the chain of command after each operation and compiled in theater-wide statistics. American Special Forces units operating in Vietnam emphasized different tactics than conventional forces, but still reflected doctrinal emphasis on firepower and communication. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, the most classified American unit in Vietnam, conducted cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia, with recon teams normally consisting of 2 or 3 American Green Berets and 4 to 6 indigenous soldiers. SEAL Team 1 conducted riverine operations throughout the Mekong Delta, inserting by boat for ambushes, intelligence gathering, and enemy observation. The standard equipment load for these units revealed their tactical priorities. A six-man team might carry an ANPRC-25 radio weighing 23 pounds for communication with headquarters and air support. M16 rifles with 20-inch barrels and 39 inches overall length served as primary weapons. Individual soldiers carried 400 to 600 rounds of ammunition per man, plus grenades, smoke grenades, and demolition charges. A six-man team moved through the jungle carrying more than 400 pounds of equipment, and the jungle heard every ounce of it. Australian counterinsurgency philosophy drew heavily on experience from the Malayan emergency that lasted from 1948 to 1960. British Commonwealth forces had successfully defeated a communist insurgency in Malaya through patient application of counterinsurgency principles, emphasizing population security over enemy destruction. Australian officers who had served in Malaya brought lessons learned from that campaign to Vietnam, adapting them to the different terrain, enemy, and political context they encountered in Phuoc Tuy province. The institutional memory of successful counterinsurgency operations gave Australian forces a doctrinal foundation that American forces, whose recent experience centered on conventional warfare in Korea and preparation for potential conflict in Europe, lacked. Australian battalion commanders viewed the body count with contempt as a measure of effectiveness in counterinsurgency operations. Their measures of effectiveness focused on denying enemy freedom of movement, separating the population from Viet Cong influence, and establishing sustainable security that could be transferred to South Vietnamese forces over time. The tactical gap between American and Australian approaches manifested in multiple dimensions. American operations emphasized speed and offensive momentum, with units conducting rapid sweeps through areas before redeploying elsewhere, according to operational plans. Australian operations emphasized patient patrolling with patrols, sometimes moving only hundreds of meters daily when operating near enemy positions. American doctrine valued firepower and communication, with heavy radio equipment and large ammunition loads standard for all units. Australian SAS patrols valued silence and stealth, communicating in whispers when necessary to speak at all, and developing hand signals for most interactions. American operations typically involved battalion or multi-battalion formations that could mass firepower against enemy positions. Australian SAS operations centered on five-man patrols that achieved effects through intelligence gathering and precisely targeted small unit actions. American forces conducted episodic operations in areas then moved on to other objectives. Australian forces maintained sustained presence in their tactical area of responsibility, conducting continuous operations that denied enemy respite. General Westmoreland reportedly complained to Australian commanders that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough according to his standards of what constituted effective operations. The Australian emphasis on patrolling, on searching villages without destroying them, on establishing ambushes and counter-ambush operations, appeared insufficiently violent compared to what American doctrine called for. Some American observers viewing Australian modified weapons for the first time thought they looked butchered, as though soldiers had taken hacksaws to military equipment without understanding proper weapons maintenance. Different definitions of success, progress, and effectiveness created friction between allies fighting the same war with fundamentally different philosophies about how to fight it. The gap between these philosophies began closing when American special operators observed Australian methods firsthand and recognized what made them effective. Chief Warrant Officer Roger Hayden, United States Navy SEAL Team 1, had graduated from Army Ranger School and Raider School and conducted riverine operations throughout the Mekong Delta before encountering Australian Special Air Service methods. His background in underwater demolition teams before the SEAL teams formed, combined with extensive formal training at elite American schools, gave him credentials that matched any special operations soldier in Vietnam. Operating from a South Vietnamese base near the U Minh forest, in what he would later describe as a pretty isolated location where his unit didn't have intelligence and didn't have much of anything, Hayden found himself in circumstances where formal training proved inadequate for the operational environment. Hayden invited Australian SAS soldiers to operate in the SEAL area of responsibility for what would become a 10-day patrol that transformed his understanding of reconnaissance operations. The Australian team, likely consisting of 5 men based on standard patrol size, joined the Americans for extended operations in the U Minh forest region, an area that would later be designated U Minh Thuong National Park. What Hayden observed during those 10 days stood in stark contrast to everything his formal military training had taught him about how special operations forces should operate. The Australians did not speak for the entire 10 days. Not a single word was uttered aloud during the patrol. All communication occurred through hand and arm signals that the Australians had developed and refined through years of jungle operations. The absolute noise discipline they maintained required professional discipline and tactical maturity that went beyond what Hayden had encountered in American units. The difference extended beyond silence to encompass every aspect of patrol operations. The Australians moved with deliberate slowness when approaching areas where enemy presence was suspected, covering minimal ground when stealth was paramount. They read signs in the jungle that remained invisible to observers without their training, identifying recent enemy passage from bent branches, disturbed leaves, and footprints that told stories about who had passed, how many, how recently, and where they were going. They positioned themselves to observe enemy movements without being observed, maintaining surveillance for hours without moving. They demonstrated patience as a tactical weapon, waiting for the right moment to act or choosing not to act at all when action would compromise their intelligence-gathering mission. Hayden watched professionals who had synthesized everything that made special operations forces effective into a seamless operational approach. His assessment, delivered years later during his first interview ever on the Jocko podcast in episodes 37 and 77, recorded in 2016 and 2017, carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Their fieldcraft was so good that you had to have your act together just to keep up with them. He learned more about reconnaissance in those 10 days with the Australians than he did anywhere else in the world, including Army Ranger School and Raider School, and all his other formal training. The admission that followed revealed the cost American forces paid for gaps in preparation. In underwater demolition teams, they just didn't have the fieldcraft to be out in the jungle looking for people. They lost a lot of SEALs because of their lack of fieldcraft preparation. American forces arrived in country with same-day turnover, receiving little to no preparation or briefing before being thrust into operations. They had to learn on the job in a combat environment where mistakes proved fatal. The casualties that resulted might have been prevented by the kind of training and tactical development that Australian forces brought to Vietnam. What Hayden would have observed during those 10 days included the employment of the modified weapons Australian patrols carried. He would have seen rifles with shortened barrels, forward pistol grips, and 30-round magazines that looked nothing like standard military issue. He would have understood through direct experience why different environments demanded different solutions, why weapons optimized for European battlefields performed inadequately in Vietnamese jungles. The recognition that regulations written in peacetime garrison environments might not serve soldiers fighting in actual combat conditions would have been impossible to miss for an observer as experienced as Hayden. The modified weapons proved their value not in planned engagements, but in the moments when SAS patrols were discovered and had seconds to survive. The standard patrol employment doctrine emphasized reconnaissance as the primary mission. 5-man teams inserted by helicopter operated beyond artillery range and often beyond immediate helicopter extraction range, gathering intelligence on enemy movements and dispositions over periods ranging from days to weeks without resupply. Patrols moved slowly near enemy positions, where rapid movement might compromise their presence. Communication occurred through whispers or hand signals to avoid detection. Patrols lit no fires that might reveal their positions through smoke or light. They established no permanent positions that enemy forces might detect through pattern analysis. Radio transmissions were kept to minimum necessary for reporting intelligence to task force headquarters. This approach worked as long as patrols remained undetected. The challenge came in moments when the careful reconnaissance was compromised, when enemy forces stumbled onto the patrol position, or when the patrol walked into unexpected enemy presence. Australians used the term bumped to describe these sudden contacts where a patrol was discovered. In those seconds between discovery and overwhelming numbers arriving, survival depended on immediate action that conventional weapons could not provide. There was no cavalry coming over the hill for a 5-man patrol operating beyond support range. Artillery fire could not help teams beyond gun range. Helicopter extraction required time that soldiers in contact with the enemy did not have. The patrol had to save itself through its own actions or perish where it stood. The tactical employment sequence for the modified weapons reflected this reality. Step 1 involved immediate, overwhelming fire from all weapons simultaneously. Every member of the patrol opened fire with full automatic bursts, emptying 30-round magazines in seconds to create maximum noise, maximum visible effect, and maximum psychological impact. Step 2 exploited the enemy's reaction to this firepower. The enormous muzzle flash, created by firing 7.62 mm NATO ammunition through shortened barrels without flash suppressors, generated fireballs visible through the jungle. The volume of fire from multiple weapons firing 30 rounds each suggested a force far larger than 5 men. The distinctive sound of full automatic 7.62 mm fire differed from anything Viet Cong forces typically encountered. Enemy forces facing this onslaught had to make rapid assessments about what they confronted. How many attackers were there? What weapons were being used? Should they press the attack or seek cover? The hesitation this confusion created, even if it lasted only seconds, provided the window the patrol needed. Step 3 capitalized on enemy confusion through rapid extraction. While Viet Cong forces were stunned, uncertain, and seeking cover, the patrol broke contact and moved rapidly away from the engagement area. Radio calls went out for helicopter extraction at designated landing zones. The goal was not to hold ground or pursue the enemy, but to preserve the patrol so it could continue its intelligence-gathering mission. The entire sequence from first shots to extraction might last only minutes, but in those minutes, the modified weapons performed the function for which they had been created. They enabled 5-man patrols to survive contact with numerically superior forces through firepower that simulated much larger units combined with tactical doctrine that emphasized breaking contact rather than seeking decisive engagement. The physics and psychology of why this worked extended beyond simple firepower calculations. The muzzle flash from shortened barrels without flash suppressors, created massive fireballs that dominated the visual environment. The sound of full automatic 7.62mm NATO rounds being fired at cyclic rate generated terrifying volume that echoed through jungle terrain. The rate of fire enabled by 30-round magazines meant that 30 rounds could be expended in seconds, creating continuous fire that suggested multiple weapons. The stopping power of 7.62mm rounds compared to 5.56mm rounds used in American M16 rifles meant that hits were more likely to immediately incapacitate enemy soldiers. The confusion factor of encountering a weapon Viet Cong forces had never seen before created uncertainty that favored the Australians. 5 men could sound like 20 or more through coordinated fire from modified weapons. The psychological impact of facing unknown weapons often proves stronger than the fear of known weapons, because humans naturally fear what they don't understand. The pattern repeated across hundreds of contacts during years of operations. From 1968 through 1969, Special Air Service squadrons conducted recce ambush operations that combined reconnaissance with ambush missions. Patrols would observe an area for several days, identifying enemy movement patterns and likely routes. They would then establish ambushes on trails enemy forces were predicted to use based on the intelligence gathered. The modified weapons proved ideal for this dual role, providing the firepower needed for effective ambushes while remaining compact enough for extended reconnaissance operations. During February through December of 1969, 3 squadron under the command of Major Reginald Beasley conducted extensive operations around the Mae Tau Mountains in northeastern Phuoc Tuy Province. These mountains, beyond artillery and mortar range of the Australian guns at Nui Dat, provided the Viet Cong secure base areas from which they could mount operations across the province without fear of immediate retaliation from Australian fire support. Multiple contacts occurred in close jungle terrain of these mountains, where the modified weapons enabled successful break contact when patrols were compromised. Veteran accounts documented at the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra and the Lithgow Small Arms Museum in Lithgow provided at least 2 separate detailed descriptions of how the modified weapons performed. Veterans assessed that the bitch actually did work and made a tangible difference on the battlefield. This was not merely an effective weapon, but an essential tool for survival that soldiers came to trust more than officially issued equipment. The trust placed in unauthorized equipment that violated every regulation exceeded the trust in weapons that met all administrative requirements, but failed to address the tactical reality soldiers faced daily. During October of 1969, Corporal Chris Roberts led a patrol operating near the Courtney Rubber Plantation when his team made contact with Viet Cong near a bunker system in circumstances that would test everything the Australian SAS had learned. 3 Squadron was conducting its second tour under Major Beasley's command, and Roberts led one of the 5-man patrols conducting reconnaissance in an area of known Viet Cong activity. The patrol moved through vegetation where visibility was limited to meters. Temperatures in the mid-30s Celsius combined with humidity above 80% created an environment where every sound seemed magnified in the stillness broken only by insect noise and the rustle of leaves in occasional breezes. The patrol was moving slowly and silently when they encountered Viet Cong forces near a bunker system. Whether the enemy spotted the patrol first or the patrol detected, the enemy became irrelevant in the split second when contact was initiated. The crisis that elevated this contact beyond the routine emerged from environmental factors beyond anyone's control. Rain had fallen approximately 1 hour before the contact occurred. Robert's primary radio had gotten wet during the downpour. When he attempted to communicate with base through normal channels after contact was initiated, the radio failed to function. The dangerous situation suddenly became critical. The patrol was engaged with enemy forces of unknown strength. They had no normal communication with base to request support or coordinate extraction. They were beyond artillery range, even if communication had been possible. Roberts found himself alone with the decision of how to handle a situation that could easily result in his entire patrol being killed or captured. The improvisation Roberts employed demonstrated both his professional competence and the value of comprehensive training that prepared soldiers to handle equipment failures. He resorted to using his VHF set, a backup radio carried for emergencies. Whispering into the handset to avoid giving away his exact position, he reached an aircraft flying into Phuoc Tuy Province on a frequency called Nui Dat RT that was monitored for emergency communications. He maintained communication while his patrol was under fire, coordinating without the benefit of normal radio procedures or frequencies. The professional composure required to whisper into a radio handset while enemy forces attempted to locate and kill his patrol reflected years of training and selection that identified men who could function under extreme pressure. The patrol employed their modified weapons during the engagement. Full automatic fire from 30-round magazines created the enormous muzzle flash and volume of fire that had become the signature of Australian SAS contact drills. The psychological impact on enemy forces facing these weapons in the darkness under jungle canopy caused the hesitation and uncertainty that the Australians had learned to exploit. Viet Cong forces uncertain of how many attackers they faced and what weapons were being employed against them, could not press their attack with the coordination and determination that might have overwhelmed a 5-man patrol. The break contact was achieved. The patrol, extracted successfully despite the radio failure that might have doomed a less professional unit or soldiers carrying less effective weapons. The aftermath of this contact reflected its significance. Major Beasley, who had kicked down the kills boards erected by earlier squadrons to emphasize that the mission was gathering information, not killing people, recognized that the severity of the engagement warranted special attention. He sent Roberts as liaison officer first to the 18th ARVN Division and later to the 199th American Light Infantry Brigade to broaden his experience and share lessons learned. Roberts' observation from this liaison duty captured the fundamental nature of the differences between Allied forces. He saw quite a difference in the way Australians and Americans operated. The differences extended beyond tactics to fundamental assumptions about the conduct of operations, about what constituted success, about how to measure progress toward objectives. The contact near Courtney Plantation demonstrated what statistics could not capture, that in the moments when survival balanced on split-second decisions and failing equipment, the illegal modifications and years of professional training became the difference between patrol members returning home or their names appearing on casualty lists. The modified weapons had solved a problem that official channels had not acknowledged existed, creating in the process the most effective close-quarters weapon employed by any force in the Vietnam War. From 1966 to 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS personnel conducted nearly 1,200 patrols across Phuoc Tuy Province and adjacent areas, compiling a record that would establish them as the most effective small unit force deployed by any nation in the Vietnam War, or BUCS. They reported observing the movements of more than 5,600 enemy troops during these operations, providing detailed intelligence about enemy strength, movements, and dispositions that enabled effective targeting by conventional forces. In 298 contacts with Viet Cong forces, they accounted for 492 confirmed enemy killed, according to official records. An additional 106 were possibly killed, with 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. The total enemy casualties inflicted exceeded 660 individuals confirmed and possible across 5 years of continuous operations. The price paid for these results revealed the effectiveness of Australian methods and modified weapons. SAS losses totaled 1 soldier killed in action and 1 who died of wounds after extraction to Australia. 3 were killed in accidents unrelated to enemy action. 1 went missing in action during 1969. His remains not found until August of 2008, when recovery operations finally located what was left after nearly 4 decades. 1 death resulted from illness. 28 men were wounded during operations over the 5-year deployment. Total fatalities across all causes numbered 7, with only 2 deaths directly attributable to enemy action in combat. The kill ratio that emerged from these numbers defied belief for anyone familiar with typical combat statistics. 492 confirmed enemy killed versus 2 Australian combat deaths produced a ratio of 246 to 1. Including the possibly killed brought the total to 598 enemy casualties versus 2 deaths, a ratio of 299 to 1. Standard reporting used the conservative figure that the kill ratio exceeded 30 to 1, which was itself the highest achieved by any unit in the Vietnam War on any side. Most American units operating in Vietnam suffered casualty rates where they inflicted fewer casualties than they sustained. Some special operations units faced casualty rates exceeding 300% annually, meaning the entire unit turned over 3 times in a year from deaths and wounds. Certain operational areas saw average patrol lifespans of 6 missions before catastrophic contact occurred. Cross-border operations into Laos recorded contact rates of 100%, meaning every single patrol was discovered, tracked, and engaged by enemy forces. The statistics, impressive as they appeared in comparison to other units, understated the SAS contribution to task force operations and raised an obvious question that American officers debated throughout the war. The intelligence gathered on patrol provided commanders the information needed to position conventional infantry units, where they would intercept enemy movements, making infantry operations far more effective than random sweeps through areas where enemy presence was uncertain. In December of 1969, SAS reconnaissance around the Mae Tao Mountains identified Viet Cong routes and staging areas with precision that allowed effective targeting. The 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and New Zealand forces mounted a month-long operation to clear the mountains based on this intelligence. The operation's success resulted directly from information gathered by SAS patrols that preceded the infantry deployment. This pattern repeated throughout the Australian deployment in Vietnam with consistent results. SAS reconnaissance would identify enemy locations and movement patterns through weeks of patient observation. Infantry battalions would then conduct operations to exploit that intelligence at times and places chosen for maximum effectiveness. The cycle would begin again in new areas as the Viet Cong adapted and relocated their base camps. The broader record of the 1st Australian Task Force provided context for SAS achievements. At least 3,370 PAVN and Viet Cong were killed in Phuoc Tuy Province during Australian operations. Australian casualties across the entire Vietnam War totaled 478 killed and 3,025 wounded. the bulk of which were sustained by the 1st Australian Task Force. New Zealand casualties during the war numbered 37 killed and 187 wounded, the majority occurring while serving in the task force. The SAS statistics were remarkable even within the context of a task force that achieved significant success in its tactical area of responsibility. The question of attribution arose whenever the statistics were examined. Was the success due to the modified weapons, or was it due to highly trained professional soldiers who would have succeeded with any weapons? The answer lay in recognizing the inseparable combination of multiple factors working together. Selection and training created elite soldiers capable of operating effectively in small teams under extreme conditions. Tactical doctrine emphasized the right approach for counterinsurgency operations, prioritizing intelligence gathering and denying enemy operational freedom over maximizing enemy casualties. The modified weapons enabled the doctrine to work by providing the tools soldiers needed to survive when reconnaissance missions were compromised. All elements proved necessary. None were sufficient alone. The weapons without the training would have been ineffective in the hands of soldiers who lacked the discipline and skills to employ them properly. The training without appropriate weapons would have left soldiers incomplete, possessing the knowledge of what to do but lacking the tools to do it effectively. If Australian methods were so effective at controlling territory and denying enemy operational freedom, why did American forces not adopt them across South Vietnam? The question had clear answers rooted in practical constraints rather than institutional stubbornness or failure to recognize Australian effectiveness. American liaison officers served with Australian units and observed their methods firsthand. Reports from the 1st Australian Task Force were available to Military Assistance Command, Vietnam headquarters, for study and analysis. Australians provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School and to the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol Training Wing at the Van Keep Training Center from 1967 onward. Roger Hayden and other American special operators experienced Australian methods directly and recognized their superiority in certain operational contexts. Yet American doctrine remained fundamentally unchanged throughout the period of major American involvement in Vietnam, despite clear evidence of Australian effectiveness. The first barrier was scale and force, density, that made replication impossible. The 1st Australian Task Force could concentrate its entire effort on a single province measuring roughly 1,000 square miles. At peak strength, about 8,000 Australian and New Zealand personnel operated in an area they could traverse in hours by vehicle or helicopter. This concentration allowed the density of coverage needed for sustained ambush operations and population control that created comprehensive surveillance networks. American forces faced responsibility for security across most of South Vietnam outside the capital region, and a few other areas held by Allied forces, encompassing tens of thousands of square miles. With more than 536,000 troops deployed at the peak in 1968 and 1969, American commanders confronted a fundamentally different operational problem, requiring different solutions. Replicating the force density Australians achieved in one province across the entire country would have required several million American troops maintained indefinitely at costs that exceeded what the American public would accept politically or the American economy could sustain. Even if American commanders recognized the effectiveness of Australian methods, they could not adopt them theater-wide without force levels that were simply unavailable. Training and force composition presented the second insurmountable barrier. The Australian SAS consisted of professional volunteers who survived a selection course designed to identify those possessing the physical stamina, mental resilience, and tactical aptitude needed for extended operations in small teams under extreme conditions. The training pipeline from selection through patrol course to operational deployment could take more than a year of continuous training and evaluation. Each soldier who completed this process represented an enormous investment that the Australian military could not afford to squander through careless employment. American forces were built largely through conscription that brought men into service for limited tours of duty lasting 12 months in Vietnam, the capability gap between a professional volunteer SAS trooper who had survived rigorous selection and extensive training and a conscripted American infantryman facing a one-year tour after basic training created fundamentally different force capabilities and limitations. The one-year tour that characterized American service in Vietnam meant that units constantly cycled personnel, losing experienced soldiers who rotated home and replacing them with new arrivals who required time to develop the skills and knowledge needed before they too rotated home. Creating forces capable of sustained small unit operations required long-term professional development that conscription-based mobilization could not provide given time constraints. Doctrinal and institutional factors formed the third barrier. American military tradition from the Civil War through the Second World War emphasized overwhelming force and rapid decisive victory as the American way of war. The body count, whatever its flaws as a measure of progress in counterinsurgency, provided quantifiable data that could be reported to political leaders and the American public as evidence of progress toward victory. Population control and denial of enemy operational freedom, the measures Australians used to assess effectiveness, proved far harder to quantify and communicate to audiences demanding clear metrics of success. How does one measure security not provided, attacks not conducted, or supplies not delivered to the enemy? The Australian measures of effectiveness, though more meaningful in counterinsurgency context according to theory, did not translate well into the metrics American political and military leadership used to assess progress and justify continued commitment of resources. The institutional preference for quantifiable measures created pressure to pursue operations that generated body counts rather than operations that denied enemy capabilities through more subtle means. Command structure constraints imposed the fourth barrier. Australian operational independence within Phuoc Tui allowed task force commanders to develop tactical approaches suited to their assessment of the situation without coordinating with American headquarters except on matters affecting mutual support between Allied forces. American battalion and brigade commanders operated within a command structure that flowed through division and corps headquarters to Military Assistance Command Vietnam at the theater level. Operational plans required approval through multiple levels of command. The autonomy to experiment with alternative approaches existed in theory, but emerged as difficult to exercise in practice when higher headquarters expected operations conforming to established doctrine and generating measurable results according to the metrics used to assess commander performance. Battalion commanders who wanted to adopt Australian-style operations faced questions from higher headquarters about why they were not generating the body counts that doctrine emphasized and that senior commanders used to assess subordinate effectiveness. What was adopted occurred informally and incompletely outside official channels. By late 1968, an unofficial Australian method was being taught at the SOG training site at Long Theng. Not formally, as it did not appear in any manual, veteran team leaders were passing on techniques to new operators: how to move silently through jungle terrain, how to position ambushes by predicting enemy movement rather than reacting to it, how to use patience as a weapon rather than viewing waiting as wasted time. Some units operating in areas where command oversight was limited started modifying their weapons, not officially or with authorization, but because operators recognized the value of shortened barrels and increased rates of fire in close quarters environments. Individual teams adopted silent movement techniques, reliance on hand signals over radio communication, and tactical patience over aggressive tempo. But no theater-wide doctrinal change occurred. No official acknowledgement was made that Australian methods might be superior to American doctrine in counterinsurgency environments. The knowledge transfer remained informal, soldier to soldier, outside official training and doctrinal channels. The war followed its predetermined course regardless of tactical success in one province, driven by factors no amount of patrol excellence could overcome. On August 18, 1971, Australian Prime Minister William McMahon announced that the first Australian task force would cease operations in October and commence phased withdrawal from Vietnam. The decision reflected political reality in Australia, where public support for the war had eroded steadily since the Tet Offensive of 1968, demonstrated that decisive victory remained elusive despite years of combat operations and optimistic official assessments. The horrific scenes on television screens had sapped public support further, creating political pressure for withdrawal that military success in one province could not counter. The last SAS patrol in Vietnam lasted 5 days, from October 1st through 5th, 1971. The patrol made no contact with enemy forces during those 5 days of operations, a quiet end that symbolized how thoroughly Australian operations had reduced enemy presence in Phuoc Tuy province through sustained pressure over 5 years. 2 Squadron, which had conducted the final tour of duty, disbanded upon return to Australia as the regiment contracted to peacetime strength. The quiet end to SAS operations in Vietnam, with the last patrol returning without contact, demonstrated the effectiveness of years of sustained operations in denying enemy forces the ability to operate freely in the province. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam assumed increasing responsibility for security of population centers as Australian forces prepared for eventual withdrawal. The operational area that had consumed multiple infantry battalions and supporting elements for more than 4 years of continuous operations showed clear evidence that sustained pressure applied through small unit operations had achieved effects that massive firepower could not produce. The question remained whether ARVN forces could maintain what the Australians had established. The Australian pattern had been continuous ambush operations around key villages, sustained patrol coverage across the province, and constant pressure that denied enemy forces respite. ARVN forces lacked the training, leadership, and motivation of professional volunteers who had undergone rigorous selection and years of specialized preparation. The unraveling began within months of Australian departure. ARVN units proved unable to maintain the operational tempo that Australian forces had sustained for 5 years. The episodic operations they conducted left gaps in coverage that enemy forces quickly identified and exploited. Viet Cong forces that had been reduced to token presence, unable to conduct effective operations, gradually returned to villages as ARVN failed to maintain the pattern of continuous ambush, operations, and population security. The province that Australian forces had dominated through patient application of counterinsurgency principles began reverting to contested status as the sustained pressure that had made enemy operations untenable ceased with the departure of the professional forces who had applied it. The final collapse came in the spring of 1975, when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive after American support ended, and South Vietnamese forces collapsed across the country. Phuoc Tuy Province fell like the rest of South Vietnam. Villages that had been denied to Viet Cong control for 5 years through Australian operations returned to communist control. The province that Australian forces had dominated for half a decade was conquered in days during the general collapse. Everything that sustained Australian pressure had achieved. Every village secured, every supply route interdicted, every enemy base camp destroyed, disappeared in the final offensive that swept away the government Australian forces had fought to preserve. No surviving examples of the modified weapons exist today. All were destroyed as contraband that violated regulations. The rifles that officially never existed could not be preserved in museums or returned to Australia for historical display. The modified weapons stayed in Vietnam, rotating between units as each squadron departed and the next arrived. When the final Australian withdrawal occurred, the weapons were destroyed rather than confiscated, eliminating the physical evidence of the tactical innovation that had proven so effective. Photographs taken during operations and veteran accounts collected in oral histories became the only remaining evidence that underscore had existed and functioned as described. The inability of South Vietnamese forces to sustain what Australian forces had achieved revealed the limits of military success that could not be transferred to indigenous forces lacking the training, leadership, and motivation that had characterized Australian operations throughout the deployment. The contrast between tactical success and strategic failure illustrated fundamental limits that purely military solutions faced. The Australians had demonstrated conclusively what was possible when professional forces applied counterinsurgency principles through sustained operations in a defined area with clear objectives. They had separated the population from guerrilla forces through continuous presence, denied the enemy freedom of movement through systematic patrol coverage, and achieved decisive control over their province through patient application of sound tactics. None of this prevented the ultimate collapse when political will to continue the war evaporated and American support ended. Yet the tactical lessons endured far beyond the strategic failure in Vietnam. David Horner published Quote 5 in 1989, providing the first comprehensive history of Australian Special Air Service operations based on patrol reports and interviews with participants. The book made Australian operations accessible to broader audiences beyond the military institutions that had begun studying them as case studies in effective counterinsurgency. Military forces worldwide recognized that the Australian experience offered practical lessons about what worked when properly trained professional forces operated according to sound tactical principles adapted to local conditions. The principles that Australian forces had validated through 5 years of sustained operations entered the permanent corpus of military doctrine worldwide. Intelligence-led operations, where reconnaissance elements identify enemy patterns and conventional forces exploit that intelligence through precision targeting, became standard practice across special operations forces globally. Extended patrol techniques involving small teams of 4 to 6 men operating for weeks without resupply trace direct lineage to Australian SAS procedures developed and refined in Vietnam. Night operations, once considered exceptionally difficult and therefore conducted sparingly by most forces, became standard across special operations after the Australians demonstrated what properly trained troops could accomplish when darkness provided operational advantage rather than obstacle. The integration of special operations forces with conventional units, with reconnaissance elements providing intelligence that guides employment of larger forces, follows the model Australian forces perfected through the intelligence operations cycle that enabled effective targeting throughout their deployment. Modern special operations weapons reflect lessons learned from Quote 6 and the recognition that operator-driven innovation sometimes produces better solutions than centralized procurement. The Mark 18 Close Quarters Battle Receiver, HK-416 variants, and other shortened barrel configurations used by special operations forces worldwide embody the same principle that Australian armorers discovered in Vietnam. One size does not fit all in special operations. Operators need ability to modify weapons for specific missions and environments. Modular systems that allow customization have become standard precisely because the Australian experience vindicated the approach of prioritizing combat effectiveness over regulatory compliance. The acknowledgement that peacetime regulations written for garrison environments may not serve soldiers in actual combat represents a philosophical shift in how military institutions approach equipment and doctrine. Roger Hayden's testimony brought the Australian story to American audiences decades after the events occurred. His appearances on Jocko Podcast in episodes 37 and 77 during 2016 and 2017 marked his first interviews ever after a career that included no books, no movies, and no social media presence. The wide reach of the podcast in the American special operations community meant that many listeners heard detailed accounts of Australian operations for the first time. The recognition of a missed opportunity during the war itself, combined with respect for Australian expertise that came decades too late to affect Vietnam operations, influenced how modern American forces approached counterinsurgency in subsequent conflicts. The period following the September 11th, 2001 attacks brought renewed interest in counterinsurgency as American forces deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Australian Vietnam operations were studied as a successful model of what properly executed counterinsurgency could achieve. Modern doctrine developed for operations in both theaters explicitly referenced lessons from successful counterinsurgency campaigns, and the principles Australians had applied in Phuoc Tuy province appeared throughout contemporary operational guidance. Small teams maintaining sustained presence in local areas. Population security prioritized over enemy body count. Intelligence-led targeting based on patient reconnaissance. All reflected the Australian model applied decades earlier in a different theater against a different enemy, but validated again through operations in the 21st century. The nickname Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle, entered the lexicon of special operations forces worldwide as shorthand for an ideal that units aspire to achieve. The concept of a force operating unseen and striking without warning captures principles that remain valid regardless of technological changes. Specific techniques have evolved as night vision equipment, satellite communications, and precision weapons became available. The underlying principle that stealth and precision can achieve effects that mass and firepower cannot remains validated by the Australian experience and continues to guide special operations employment globally. Academic study of Australian operations has produced detailed statistical analysis impossible during the operations themselves. Researchers mapping thousands of combat incidents across 5 years have identified patterns that individual participants could not perceive during operations when they lacked the broader perspective. The research confirms that Australian forces achieved favorable contact ratios, with 9 successful engagements for every 10 times they encountered enemy forces. The village ambush operations conducted during 1969 and 1970 produced measurable effects on enemy capability that large-scale American search and destroy missions did not achieve, despite consuming far greater resources. The documentation provides empirical foundation for doctrinal conclusions about effective counterinsurgency that might otherwise rest solely on anecdotal evidence and individual recollections. Modern special operations forces worldwide share characteristics that reflect the Australian model developed in Vietnam. Small teams operating in denied or hostile territory far from support. Balance between stealth to avoid contact and lethality to win if compromised. Modified or customized weapons tailored for specific mission requirements. Cultural sensitivity and tactical patience that prioritize long-term objectives over short-term results. Intelligence gathering as primary product with direct action as secondary mission. Integration with conventional forces to enable broader effects than small teams could achieve alone. All trace lineage to principles that Australian SAS validated through sustained operations across 5 years in Phuoc Tuy Province. The lessons military institutions absorbed extended beyond tactical techniques to encompass force structure and employment philosophy. Professional volunteers prove more effective for special operations than conscripts, regardless of how well conscripts are trained. Selection and training investments are essential and cannot be shortcut without degrading capability. Tactical patience often achieves more than aggressive tempo in counterinsurgency environments. Intelligence gathering frequently matters more than direct action for creating conditions that enable success. Small professional units can achieve effects disproportionate to their size when properly employed. Sustained pressure over months produces better results than episodic large operations that generate temporary effects. Combat necessity may require violating peacetime regulations written for garrison environments that do not reflect battlefield reality. The political lesson proved equally important, though more difficult for military institutions to internalize. Tactical excellence cannot compensate for strategic incoherence when the fundamental challenge is political rather than military. Military force can create conditions for political solutions through security and control. It cannot create the political solution itself when underlying conditions do not support sustainable governance and popular legitimacy. The South Vietnamese government lacked the legitimacy and capability to maintain security without external support indefinitely. No amount of Australian military success in Phuoc Tuy Province could substitute for viable national politics. The lesson learned at great cost in Vietnam through years of combat has informed subsequent debates about the use of military force in conflicts where political factors dominate military considerations. The question the bitch represents remains unresolved in military institutions worldwide. When does combat effectiveness justify violating regulations designed for peacetime conditions? Australian SAS soldiers prioritized mission success and survival over regulatory compliance, accepting the risk of disciplinary action for tactical advantage. Modern forces face similar questions whenever the gap emerges between what regulations require and what combat demands. The balance between discipline that regulations enforce and flexibility that operations require has no universal answer. Context determines whether violation is justified. The Australian example suggests that soldiers closest to the combat environment often understand requirements better than administrators far removed from tactical reality, but it also demonstrates the importance of professional judgment in determining when rules serve valid purposes and when they impede effectiveness. The Australian withdrawal from Phuoc Tuy Province in October of 1971 marked the end of one of the more successful Allied military campaigns in the Vietnam War, measured by tactical effectiveness and operational results achieved over sustained periods, and the beginning of an influence on military doctrine that continues to shape special operations forces worldwide more than half a century later. 580 men served in Australian Special Air Service squadrons in Vietnam across 6 squadron tours spanning 5 years of continuous operations. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols covering the length and breadth of Phuoc Tuy Province and extending into adjacent provinces when missions required. They achieved a kill ratio of 246-1, the highest recorded by any unit in the Vietnam War on any side. They provided intelligence that enabled effective conventional operations throughout the province. They demonstrated what professional forces applying sound counterinsurgency principles could accomplish in a defined area over sustained periods. When they departed, the success they had achieved could not be sustained by forces lacking their training, selection, leadership, and commitment. The tactical methods developed during those 5 years entered the permanent corpus of professional military knowledge. The bitch, the illegal weapon that violated every regulation, influenced doctrine and equipment development across special operations forces globally. The modified rifles prove that operator-driven innovation sometimes produces better solutions than official procurement channels. The vindication came not through official recognition during the war, but through the influence the concept exerted on how military institutions worldwide approach the relationship between regulations and combat effectiveness. Modern forces accept that operators need ability to customize weapons and equipment for specific missions, that one-size-fits-all approaches fail in special operations, that peacetime regulations may not serve soldiers in combat. The strategic outcome toward which those tactical methods could not contribute sufficiently remains a reminder that war is ultimately decided not by tactics alone, but by the complex interaction of military operations, political will, economic resources, popular legitimacy, and strategic coherence across all elements of national power working in concert toward objectives that must be sustainable over time. The Australians created conditions for political success through military excellence. They could not create the political success when the South Vietnamese government lacked the capacity and legitimacy to sustain what military force had established. Sometimes people doing things differently are not doing them wrong. They are just solving problems that others have not yet recognized exist. The Australian Special Air Service recognized that jungle warfare in Vietnam demanded approaches different from conventional doctrine developed for other environments. They created solutions that regulations did not anticipate and could not accommodate. They left a legacy that continues to influence how special operations forces train, equip, and fight more than 50 years after the last patrol returned from Phuoc Tuy Province without firing a shot. The question of when necessity should override regulation remains as relevant today as it was in 1968, when armorers first took hacksaws to standard-issue rifles and created weapons that would prove devastatingly effective precisely because they violated every rule written to govern them. Bro.